Thank you so much for coming along this lunchtime. As Jordan says, we're asking the question, what does Jesus say about suffering? Which is not exactly a light lunch topic, is it? But it is unavoidable. Everywhere you look, you find hurting people. There's tragedy after tragedy on the news, and actually surrounded by people suffering as well. Isn't that right? Friends who are struggling emotionally or mentally or physically. There is so much pain. And it raises huge questions. And perhaps some of us are here because we want to engage with those questions. But perhaps others of us are here because it goes even further than just questions. This is more than academic. Some of you might be here and might be really hurting. And so can I say before anything else, whatever brings you here, I'm so glad that you've come. Thinking through this topic is not always easy and not always comfortable. But I do think that what I found in the Christian faith is a satisfying response to my pain. And that's what I want to share at this lunchtime. Because for a lot of people, suffering is used to dismiss God entirely. We see pain in our world, disasters and tragedies, and we think he isn't there. He isn't there at all. In 2015, you probably saw it, Stephen Fry was on Irish TV, and he was asked what he'd say to God, and I quote, "I'd say, bone cancer in children. What's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world in which there's so much misery that is not our fault? The moment you banish him," that's God, "life becomes simpler, cleaner, purer, more worth living, in my opinion." And it's not just Stephen Fry. For many centuries, people have framed the question like this. If God were powerful, then he'd be able to stop suffering. If God were loving, then he'd want to stop suffering. But our world is full of suffering. So either God isn't powerful enough, or he isn't good enough, or he just isn't there at all. And I don't know about you, but when I was an atheist, that logic sounded really compelling. But now I think over that question, there's actually a huge flaw here. And it's as simple as this. What if God has a good reason to allow suffering that we don't know anything about? You see, that logic assumes that any possible reason for suffering out there will be something that we immediately understand. And at this point, you might hear me say that and think, well, look, what possible reason could God have to allow suffering? Let me just say, I don't know what those reasons are. I'm not even sure I know what they could be, but that's kind of the point. See, as human beings, our perspective is finite and profoundly limited. If God is just like me, just like you, and no bigger, well then obviously we should expect to understand fully everything he does. And so in this issue, we'd be right to reject him, because if we can't come up with a reason for it, then there couldn't be one. But what if God is bigger than us? If he were, then it is at least possible that he has a reason we don't yet understand. And if we dismiss that possibility out of hand, then we are in danger of some really shallow thinking. The kind of thinking that says, if I can't understand or imagine it, then it can't exist. But look, if God is bigger than us, transcending us and our perspective, then that objection actually falls apart. And let me say, the God who is bigger than I am is the only kind of God I'm willing to believe in. In fact, a God who is big enough to blame must be big enough to know something more that I don't. Now, everything I've just said does not make the fact of suffering any easier to take. I know that. But it does at least mean that the fact of suffering doesn't automatically rule God out. And in fact, I'd want to go even further. You see, suffering raises huge questions for the believer, but it also raises huge questions, maybe even bigger ones, for those who dismiss God. What happens when you take God out of the picture? Dismiss him, and what are you left with? Well, let me quote someone who puts it extremely honestly. Writing in River Out of Eden, Professor Richard Dawkins puts it like this. In a universe of electrons and selfish genes, blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe that we observe has precisely the properties we should expect, if there is at bottom, No design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. See, Christians talk about the problem of suffering, the problem of evil, but at least we have a problem. Dismiss God and you're left with no design, no purpose, no evil, no good. And in that meaningless universe, in what way can you say that suffering is really a problem? In what way can you say that it's really wrong? You see, when we encounter suffering, our instinct is to say, it shouldn't be this way. To say, that's wrong. But if we dismiss God, who's to say what should or shouldn't be the case? Who's to say what's right, what's wrong? Those things become no more than opinion. The writer C.S. Lewis was an atheist who became a Christian, and facing up to suffering was actually part of his journey to faith, not away from it. He put it like this: my argument against God was that the universe seemed so cruel and unjust. But how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? And I have to say, I found that in my own life. I'm going to show you a picture now of my friend Rebecca. And you won't believe it, but next slide. The person next to her is me. I've aged so badly, and that picture was only taken 5 years ago. So, life is hard. I loved her. I say I loved her because in the third year of university, 5 years ago, she passed away. She and I studied English together. She was a brilliant rower. She had a lively mind. She was a wonderful friend. And when she died in a car crash before the final term of third year, I found out what suffering is really like. I was devastated. I struggled with all kinds of questions. I could barely get out of bed. But I also had to be honest, looking back. See, if we really are nothing more than time and matter and chance, then nothing meaningful had happened. Rebecca was just an accident, just like me, just like you. Some people get hurt, some people get lucky. But the truth is, that conclusion made no sense of her. She didn't feel like an accident, and we didn't treat her like one. She was more like a gift, someone who came into our lives, someone who made a difference, someone who made us laugh and smile. Someone who's worth missing, someone worth crying over, a gift. And if she was a gift, then someone who pointed to a giver. Or take the French writer Guillaume Bignon, who also used to be an atheist. He wrote after the awful Paris attacks in the past few years, in reality, to be a consistent atheist, one must affirm that the Islamic terrorists in Paris didn't do anything wrong as such. They only acted out of line with our personal preferences and in line with theirs. If there's no ultimate arbiter of right and wrong, that's all we're left with. Hearts are heavy and thinking objectively is difficult when it hurts. But ultimately, as the French face this seemingly purposeless evil, one side must deny that it's evil, and the other must deny that it's purposeless. You see, the fact that suffering hurts, the fact that it seems like something worth getting angry about, all of that only makes sense if God is there. For our pain to mean anything and to matter, God must be in the picture. And so I want to begin by saying this gently. For Christians, suffering is a problem, but at least it is a problem. And it's a problem to take seriously. One of the things I found when I came to the Bible was that it didn't give me one-line responses or knee-jerk reactions. It didn't simplify the fact of my suffering or short-circuit it with easy answers. In fact, there's a whole book of the Bible called Job, which you could go and read, which does that. Almost its whole message is to say, don't try giving easy answers to suffering, because there aren't any. Don't try saying that all suffering is punishment, not your place to say that. There is so much that isn't my place to say. So this lunchtime, I'm not going to say those things. But I also found when I came to the Bible that it wasn't silent. There was something to be said. It wasn't lacking in comfort or challenge. And in fact, the response that it gave, while not being exhaustive, was satisfying. I didn't know everything, but the more I listened to Jesus, the more I found I had enough. And Jesus does speak clearly to suffering people like he did to me. I just want to share this lunchtime 4 things he says. Here's the first response Jesus makes. He says it wasn't meant to be this way. See, Jesus looks at the suffering of our world and he tells us it wasn't meant to be this way. There's a moment in Jesus' life when his close friend Lazarus falls ill and then dies. You can read about it in these eyewitness accounts. Take it away, see for yourself. It's in chapter 11. But one of the strange things about Jesus' response is that he's angry. You read there, when Jesus saw his sister, that's Lazarus' sister, weeping, and the Jews who'd come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. And in the Greek, those words don't just mean sad, they mean angry. He's really angry. And that's because suffering in our world is worth getting angry about. While I don't share Stephen Fry's conclusion, I think it's way off base, the fact he's angry tells me he understands something very important about suffering. Our world was not meant to be this way, which is why we struggle with it, which is why the Welsh poet Dylan Thomas wrote to his father not to go gentle into that good night, but to rage against the dying of the light. For Christians, sorrow and anger are right responses to the way things are now, because things weren't meant to be this way. According to the Bible, reality is out of joint. Something about our world is deeply broken. We were each made for a relationship with God, and our turning away from God, our breaking of that relationship, has left our world broken as well. And at this point, we often wonder, well, why would God allow that to happen? But it comes down to what God made human beings for. He didn't make us to be robots that he programmed unthinkingly. He made us to be people who loved him and were loved by him genuinely. And for that love to be real love, it had to include the possibility of rejection. The freedom for us to choose not to love God. If you've ever loved someone, you'll know that love is dangerous like that. It leaves you vulnerable. And because God created a universe with the possibility of real love, that was always an option. Now, do you hear me? This is not to say that individual acts of sin or wrongdoing bring about individual moments of suffering. Not at all. But rather that suffering in our world is a clear sign to us that things aren't right. I'll quote C.S. Lewis again. He wrote, "God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks to us in our conscience, but shouts to us in our pain. It's his megaphone to rouse a deaf world." Suffering alerts us to the fact that something is deeply wrong, that things aren't meant to be this way. Our pain is a symptom of a broken world, and the underlying cause is an attitude towards God that rejects him, what the Bible calls sin. And at this point, I want to ask an awkward, uncomfortable question. Are we prepared to acknowledge how much suffering is human in origin? Even many of the natural disasters we see actually have human exploitation, wastefulness, and greed lurking at the bottom of them. Are we prepared to acknowledge that we have a hand in the suffering of others? That we've played our part in hurting them? We often look at the world and the suffering, we say, how could God allow that to exist? But the truth is, much of the time, I am at least complicit in it, and sometimes more. So the real question becomes, how could God allow me to exist? It wasn't meant to be this way. Suffering shows us that something has gone very wrong and it's worth getting angry about, like Jesus does. But that's not his only response. Jesus looks at the suffering in our world and he says, it won't always be this way. See, this episode with Lazarus is like no other funeral in history. If Jesus had just gone there to mourn, then to be honest, we probably would never have heard about it. But the reason why this episode has survived for 20 centuries and been narrated and shared and basically gone viral is because of what Jesus did at that funeral. Read chapter 11 and you'll find he went to this funeral to end the grief by raising Lazarus from the dead. And in fact, when you study Jesus' life, you'll find these accounts of him tell us that he was always bringing healing to the sick, bringing sight to the blind, bringing hope to the cynical, and like with Lazarus, even bringing life to the dead. Jesus was waging war on suffering everywhere he went, and he was winning. Now, we might have lots of questions about the miraculous things Jesus does in the Bible. Do ask them. It's worth saying just for now that these are historical documents that we're looking at, which bear all the signs of eyewitness testimony. But a big point to get is this. The miracles of Jesus are not divine party tricks. Look what I can do. They are pointers to what God ultimately plans for the world. Get to the end of the Bible and you find the picture is of a changed world. A world made new, a world without the suffering in it. A world without pain. God comes out with the stunning promise that there'll be no more death, no more mourning. That God himself will wipe away every tear from his people's eyes. I don't know if any of you are big fans of The Lord of the Rings, but I always think of that moment where Sam Gamgee sees Gandalf having thought he was dead. And he says, Gandalf, you're alive, but I thought you were dead. But does this mean that everything sad is going to come untrue? Tolkien could write that because he was a Christian, and he knew this promise of a world made new, a world in which everything sad is going to come untrue. God doesn't intend for his world to languish in suffering. He plans to wipe every tear away, to bring unspeakable comfort to the brokenhearted. And if, like me, you've gone through times of real suffering, then that promise is worth digging into. And if it's true, it's worth holding out for. A world without the stuff of suffering in it, no tears, no pain, no suffering. We are right to long for that world because God says one day it will be a reality. And you might be thinking, fine, one day. What about now? It's all very well to go to pained people in their suffering and tell them that one day it will be better. Does God have anything to give them now? Well, here's the next response Jesus makes. Jesus looks at our suffering world and he says, I choose to suffer with you. That's God's response to pain. He doesn't sit distant on some celestial throne. The claim of the Christian faith, which no other religion makes, is that God came down here to be one of us. Not just as some kind of illusion, not just as a costume he wore for a little bit, but to take to himself a human nature so that he could make this world, our world, of pain and suffering and struggle, his home. You find a God who's not indifferent to pain, but deeply involved in it. You see, often we think about the problem of suffering and we're inclined to rage at God. Even in the Bible, you find people who come close to doing that. We rage at God and we say, okay, your move, God. All I see is a world of brokenness and pain, and as far as I can tell, you don't care. What's your move, God? And this is God's move. Not to try and give us some answer or an explanation or even a telling off, but to give us a person. God offering himself in Jesus. And can I say from experience, in knowing Jesus, it's not that all my questions go away, but being in a relationship with him changes things. No, I don't know everything, but I find that I know enough. I don't have all the answers, but I find that I have enough. And here's part of the reason why. Jesus looks at our pain and he says, I choose to suffer with you. Read that account of Jesus at the tomb of Lazarus. And before he raises his friend from the dead, shortest verse in the Bible, pub quiz question, Jesus wept. Jesus wept. Now why does he do that? It's because he cares. It's because he loves that much. I normally like most Christmas carols, but the one I hate is Away in the Manger. It's got a really flaccid tune, and it's usually sung by squeaky children. It's a terrible carol. But the worst thing about it is the line, the little Lord Jesus, no crying he makes. Because that line is a lie. It makes it sound like Jesus is immune to the pain, when all the evidence we have shows us that he felt the pain. Which means we're not alone in our suffering, because God himself has suffered. He knows what it's like to cry. But he goes even further than that. Here's the fourth thing Jesus says to our suffering world. I choose to suffer for you. Jesus ended his life on a cruel Roman cross, facing all the ugliness of human nature. Betrayed, tortured, murdered. But it wasn't a surprise to him. In fact, it seemed to have been his plan all along. He was constantly saying that this was his goal. By dying this kind of death that only the worst criminals deserve to die, Jesus claimed that he would be dealing with the root problem of all suffering. Not just the symptoms, but the cause. You see, he claimed to be God, come in person, to pay the price for our rejection of him. Jesus came to suffer so that he could end suffering. And the reason why I would dare say such a sweeping thing is what happened after he died. 3 days later, despairing and desolate, Jesus' hopeless friends went to his tomb and found it empty. And although they could barely believe it, they then encountered him alive again, saw him, spoke to him, touched him, ate food with him, just as he told them they would. And spurred on by what they saw, they turned the world upside down. Now that's something we're going to spend a bit of time this evening looking at. So come to Bakesmith's, there's going to be some great jazz and a chance to dig into that evidence. Can I say that for me, that evidence was the deal breaker for my atheism. I couldn't move past it and I had to change. But I want to finish by saying, when we look at all the pain, we want to ask, where is God when it hurts? But when we look to Jesus, we find even if we don't get all the answers, we do get enough. Is God evil? No. I see Jesus dying on a cross for me. I may not understand everything about what he's planning, but when I look at how far he'd go for me, I know there's no cruelty in him. Is God weak? Unable? No. Jesus rose again. He destroyed death, our most feared enemy. He left an indelible mark in history, and he kickstarted a community that is growing to this day. Christians don't have all the answers, but in Jesus we do have what we need. And if I know this God, the one who can take the evil and the sorrow and the treachery of Jesus' crucifixion and turn it to good, then I can trust him. Then genuine hope becomes an option. Then peace, which previously seemed unimaginable, which even now transcends understanding, becomes part of my experience. And even in the midst of my pain, Jesus says he chooses to suffer with us and for us. That's a comfort and a hope and a joy that I don't want any of you to miss out on. And you could have it today, this lunchtime. That's what Jesus says. If that's something you're interested in doing, do come find me and talk to me. But now we're going to have a little bit of time for questions, so why not take 30 seconds or so, talk to the person next to you, text in any other questions you have, and then we'll come to think about them.
Great. So the first question I've got is, do you believe in miracles? Why does God choose to alleviate the pain of only some? And if he can intervene, why not do it always? It's 3 questions in one.
Yeah, three very good questions, all of which make sense together. And in a way, so let me answer the first one. Do I believe in miracles? I do, which is where the other 2 questions came from. If I said I didn't, then I guess the rest of the questions would be moot. I do believe in miracles. Actually, as a Christian, I kind of have to. At the heart of what I believe is that Jesus rose from the dead. And one thing Christians have never thought was that was a normal thing that happens every day. We've always thought that was out of the ordinary. And we can talk more about the nature of what a miracle is. There are some people who define it in such a way that maybe as a Christian, I'm not sure I'd want to do that. So text in if you've got more questions on miracles. But the real heart of that question, as far as I can tell, is if God can do miracles, if he can intervene and stop stuff, why doesn't he do it all the time? Why not stop the train that heads to Auschwitz? Why not stop the plane that flies into the Twin Towers? And it is a really, really big question. And to be honest with you, maybe you can guess this from the talk I gave, it's not a question I'm in a position to answer. That's not that there isn't an answer, but I'm not in a position to answer it. I'm not sure I can tell you why God does and doesn't intervene when he does and doesn't intervene. But I do have a few things to say about that. The first thing to say is that God's plan for this world is much, much more than a minor disaster averted, or even a major disaster averted. It's huge. One of the things Jesus says is, I am making all things new. His plan for this world is not so much about temporary fixes, plasters on problems. It is to deal with everything all the way down, to make a whole new world in which that kind of question's unnecessary, because there'll be no evil or harm to intervene in. That's his goal. And so, because that's his goal, what he's done in sending us Christ is make it possible for us to be part of that world. I know it sounds so hard to take, and I know that in the midst of pain it is hard to take. But actually, one of the things an early Christian writer called Paul said was that it changes your perspective. He said, and believe me, this guy Paul had the most ridiculous experience of suffering. He'd been stoned to death, he'd been stoned half to death. He'd been shipwrecked multiple times. I've not even been shipwrecked once. He'd been beaten, he'd been whipped in public, humiliated really as a Jewish citizen. But he said, our light and present troubles are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed. And that's a huge thing to hear. I know if you don't have faith that Paul had, then it sounds crazy. But if there is such a thing as eternity, if after billions and billions of years you will still be there, then perhaps what you're looking forward to would render your present pain, in the words of Paul, light and momentary. And he's not saying that as someone who hasn't suffered, and I'm not going to try and put that on you and say it should feel that way. But I am saying that for those who come to know Jesus, that's a perspective shift that enters their mind more and more. I've started to find that as well.
Great, thanks, Niv. The next question, if Jesus says that the world's not meant to be this way with regards to suffering, how did God let it happen?
Great, and I think that's exactly what I was trying to cover. Obviously didn't do it very well. Essentially, when he says the world wasn't meant to be this way and it won't always be this way, he's talking about something that went wrong. And right near the beginning of the Bible, actually, you read what that was. It's what I tried to describe earlier, that attitude towards God that turned away from him, that rejected him. We find these two figures, Adam and Eve, who are in a garden, and it's a beautiful garden. And God says to them, you're free to do whatever you want, eat whatever you want. Just don't eat from this tree of the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil. And the thing is, when God says that, he's not making an arbitrary comment about fruit. This tree is a powerful symbol for our ability to reject God. Because as I said in the talk, he invites us to real love, a relationship of real love in which there is a possibility of rejection. This tree signifies that. And for them to eat of that tree was for them to push God out of the picture. And then everything goes wrong. If God's the one who makes all things, sustains all things, then to be out of kilter with him is to be out of kilter with the way things are meant to be. If God is the one who gives you life and joy, then to be cut off from him is to be left with the opposite of those things, death and mourning, which is why suffering is in our world. Like C.S. Lewis says, it's a big wake-up call. Now, I remember I was speaking once at another uni, and someone said to me, isn't that really anthropocentric? And it's a great long word to say if you're really furious. The only time I've ever heard someone use that word angrily. But the answer is yes, it is. The Bible says the most remarkable things about human beings, that more than any other creature on earth, we have been made with a unique capacity to change the world around us. And what's interesting is that here in the 21st century, I think we all agree with that. Look at global warming. Look at what happens to the climate when we are around. The idea that the way we act has an impact on everything else does not seem that crazy to me in the world today. But yes, something went wrong. Christians call it the fall, and at the root of it is that attitude rejecting God called sin. Yeah.
Thanks, Niv. There's loads of questions. We're not going to have time to get to them all, so if your question doesn't get answered, talk to Niv afterwards, but we're still going to go for a couple more. So if Jesus promises to make all things new in the future, what about now? How does God help us in our suffering now?
It's a brilliant question, and again, one that I clearly didn't deal with very well in the talk. The point is he gives us two things. One, he gives us a companion in our pain. One of the things that Christians have always said about Jesus from the Bible is that he is a man of sorrows, familiar with pain. So in our pain, we are not alone. Today, the Christian experience is of weeping, but knowing that God weeps with us. Being heartbroken, but knowing that he has entered into that. That makes a huge difference. And there's more to say on that. He gives us a community. Actually, when I lost my friend at uni, I found it was a community of God's people who were able to care for me richly, look after me, provide for me. That community is huge. And actually, I hope here at the CU, you're coming in as a guest to this event, I hope you discover just a bit of that community. A place where you are welcome. A place where you don't have to feel a certain way. That's what a community of God's people is like. And powerfully, he gives us hope. Tonight, we're thinking more about hope, so I don't want to say all the things I'm going to say then, but we do need hope to keep going. And the hope that we get in Jesus is like nothing else. It's as solid as his resurrection, which, again, come this evening, is a really well-established event in terms of historical evidence. So that's what we get now. And it's a lot. And I tell you something crazy. It's almost hard to really describe it. But I meet Christians who go through terrifically bad things. And they would say that they know joy and peace. Not in those things. Not even because of those things. They're not masochists. But because in Jesus they do have something that never stops giving joy and peace. No matter how bad things get. No matter what else threatens them. That's part of it too.
Great, thank you. Someone asks, if God became human to understand our suffering, does that mean God didn't understand human suffering before that? Is he not all-knowing?
Great question. A great question. Whoever asked that is probably someone who's thinking about classical theology. Well, the answer is a sort of yes and no. As God, someone who is, nothing like us, whose knowledge of things is of a different order, there is nothing he does not know, of course. But that's not the same as personal experience, is it? And God becoming flesh in Jesus, actually a lot of that is on offer to us. It's not that in the incarnation he began to know things he didn't have an intellectual understanding of before, but rather he made it scandalously possible for him to experience things that it was not possible for the divine being to experience before. God cannot change, God cannot suffer, God cannot die. But in the incarnation you find God taking another nature to himself. That is what the Council of Chalcedon, if you're ever interested in, was focusing on. That in Jesus you have one person with two natures, so that he could. And you might kind of go, well, if he knows it already, what's the point? But if you ask that, I rather suspect you haven't suffered. Because for someone who has suffered, you realize that that was a breathtaking thing for God to do. To stoop down to experience a thing he never had to, so that he could offer me, in those experiences, his comfort, his presence. And that's breathtaking.
Thank you. We'll go with one last question. And like I said, if you want to talk to Niv afterwards about anything he said or any missed questions, do grab him. He's very friendly. This last question says, are you saying that if you're non-Christian, you can't have a moral compass?
No, I'm not saying that. So thank you. But I am saying that apart from a theistic explanation of ethics, that is, apart from a God who anchors what that moral compass would look like, you have no good reason to trust it, no good reason to know that where it points is where it ought to point, and no good reason to tell anyone else to follow it. Basically, if there is no moral arbiter of good and evil who has the final say, then all of our moral intuitions, as powerful as they may feel to us, can't be put onto other people. And as powerful as they may feel to us, may be nothing more than the level of opinion. The protest against God that the world seems evil only works if there is such a thing as evil, if things aren't meant to be this way. So of course, those who aren't Christians have a wonderful sense of moral intuition, and many people I know who have no religious faith are far kinder, more decent and nice than I am, as you'll find if you talk to me. But the question is not about whether you can be moral or not. It's about whether that morality is compelling outside of your own experience. That's the question.